Marriage is a lot of things. It's an emotional connection, it's an economic union, it's a parental partnerships, it's a mixing of families, and so on. It's also, in many ways, a contract, a promise entered into by two or more parties that has legal and financial consequences for the people involved. In some cultures, it's actually written out as a contract, and it's called that, a marriage contract. Now, like a lot of contracts, marriages can have transfers of property involved. Now, think for a moment of what's happening in a marriage. Now, from the point of view of the happy couple, the two of them are just getting married. It's really about them. But from the point of view of the lineages of the larger family, there's a transfer of a person. Right? Suppose, for example, that you live in a patrilineal, patrilocal society. When one of the men in your lineage gets married, the couple comes to live with the father's family, with the husband's family. That means a woman from another lineage is going to come into your household. She's going to leave her home and come to yours, where she'll make all the contributions that a woman makes to the household, right? Including her work and subsistence, her participation in social life, and most importantly, her role in bearing and raising new members of your lineage. That's a pretty big net gain from your point of view, right? Marriage is a great thing. And in a lot of cultures, gains like that have to be reciprocated. You can't just take something valuable, even a person from another family, without providing something in return. Now, in a lot of societies, that means that there's a tradition of material payments that occur at marriage in exchange for the bride. This used to be called bride price in a lot of anthropological literature, and you'll still see that term now and then. Usually, though, nowadays people use the term bride wealth, because bride price can give you the impression that the bride is a chattel, that she's being purchased, that she's being sold from one lineage to another, and that's not true. That's not the case at all. The payment isn't a purchase. It's a return gift, a recognition of the value that the marriage has brought to the family. Now, bride wealth can take any number of forms depending on the economic system involved. Sometimes it's payment in cattle. Sometimes it's payment in food. Sometimes in money. Sometimes it's in work. When it's in work, it usually means that the new son-in-law will have to go work for a prolonged period for his parents-in-law. We call that bride service as opposed to bride wealth. Whatever form it takes, it's usually the subject of some pretty intense negotiations. The size of the gift has to be worked out in advance, and very often both sides try to drive a hard bargain over it. Now, it's also something that often creates a real barrier for marriage for young men. In many cases, it can take years and a lot of networking to earn and borrow the number of cattle or other goods that are necessary to provide the bride wealth. Now, bride wealth involves money going from the groom's family to the bride's family. It can go the other way. It can go from the bride's family to the groom's family. When that happens, we call it dowry. Dowry tends to work a little bit differently than bride wealth. In many cases, for example, the dowry that a woman brings into the marriage belongs to her, not to her husband, even after they're married. And in societies where men own most of the property, it can actually be very important for a woman to have the dowry because that gives her some sort of property that she controls. Now, that's not always the case then, though, and there are as many variations on dowry as there are on bride wealth. Now, there's also a question of your contractual obligations if the new bride or groom doesn't work out. Now, again, remember that marriage can be seen as an arrangement between families in which one provides a son and the other provides a daughter to the other. Well, what happens if the person provided doesn't live very long? It's a tragedy, of course, but it's also a sort of default on the agreement. Family A was supposed to provide a bride to family B, and a year after the marriage, she dies. They can demand their money back. That is, they can demand their bride wealth back. But often that's not really in anybody's interest. Both families wanted the marriage to take place after all, and they still want it to be there even after the original spouse has died. And so very often they'll supply a replacement. Who's the best person to replace the deceased spouse? Well, it should be someone from the same family, as close as possible to the old one, because then all the arrangements of kinship and lineage and everything that were associated with the original marriage will occur with the new one as well. So the ideal person to replace a spouse who's died is the brother or sister of that spouse, a sibling. Now, if it's a woman that does this, we actually use the Latin word for sister, familiar to you from sororities, to describe it. We call this custom the sororit. The sororit is a custom in which if a woman passes away, her sister will then replace her in the marriage, if the sister is not married. If it goes the other way, if a man replaces his brother who's passed away in the marriage, we call that the levirate. Now, you may think of this as a little weird, and to tell you the truth, I tended to think of this as pretty exotic until I discovered that it happened in my own family quite recently. Right around the turn of the century, my great-great-aunt Katrina came over from Denmark to marry a Danish immigrant from the same island. They came from a little island called Mors in Denmark, named Mads Madsen. She had a little girl, my Aunt Helen, and she then died suddenly a few months later, not out of childbirth, but out of a disease. Now, within a couple of months, her sister Patria had arrived to take care of the baby, and shortly after that, she married Mads Madsen, with whom she had a long and very happy marriage. I grew up thinking of this woman as Aunt Patria, and it was never quite clear to me how Aunt Patria had happened to immigrate to Denmark. It was, in fact, a case of the sororit, though nobody actually used that term. These kinds of arrangements are actually much more common in our own families, much more common than we realize. And if you ask around in your own family, you may find some there. Indeed, all the terms that we've been talking about involving marriage, exogamy and endogamy, bride, wealth, and dowry, residence and spouse selection, all of them are relevant to your own society and your own family, wherever you come from. So as you look at your own family, try to work out what some of these patterns are there. You may find that by examining these, you'll discover that your own family has a richer cultural heritage and a stronger connection to some distinctive cultural ways of doing things than you realized before.